Let me repeat that. Was the polygamy revelation made on July 12, 1843, done by Joseph Smith under threat of death in order to escape the Missouri writ threatened him with execution for treason? If you look at the timeline, looks like it was. That this was a big hoax. If anyone wants to believe that Joseph Smith actually had this revelation, the timeline suggests that Joseph Smith did not make this revelation willingly, but did it under the threat of death, and he made it with the possible calculation of escaping out of the Mormon Church permanently. Was Doctrine and Covenants, section 132, Revelation on polygamy, done by Joseph Smith while he was under the threat of death? Certainly the timing of the revelation is extremely suspicious. But we do know that on July 12th, Joseph Smith was under threat of being extradited into Missouri and possibly executed. 3 days after signing off on this revelation, Joseph Smith resigns the office of prophet, reversing what the prophecy says, which there can only be one prophet at a time on the earth, and Joseph Smith resigns immediately thereafter, passing the office of prophet to Hiram, who reverses through all his speeches the prophecy of polygamy. And third, Joseph Smith transfers all his property, 60 lots in Nauvoo, and his complete share in the steamboat Maid of Iowa to Emma Smith and his children, in what I believe to be a prelude for his escape from Nauvoo and certain death. Because Joseph Smith was in fear for his life and was planning on escaping, because there was no guarantee that Governor Ford was not going to authorize the extradition, send Joseph Smith into Missouri, and to his inevitable death. Further, this document also shows that there were 3 things that all the Joseph Smith enemies wanted to accomplish. 1, the revelation on polygamy, which they accomplished on July 12th. 2, the resignation of Joseph Smith from the church so they could take over the church. And 3, that throwing the political support of Nauvoo over to the Democratic Party. All 3 of these goals were accomplished. John C. Bennett, Sidney Rigdon, and the 12 accomplished all 3 of these goals. And I believe this was the bargain with the devil that Joseph Smith struck with his secret enemies. So come along with me as we investigate other theories of Joseph Smith, polygamy, and the Mormon Church. What we do know that on July 12th, when the purported revelation of D&C 132 on polygamy was received by Joseph Smith, Joseph Smith was under threat of being extradited into Missouri, and that Governor Ford had yet to make a decision on whether or not he was going to reverse the extradition. Also, according to these documents on the Joseph Smith website, there were 10 or 12 Missourians waiting for Joseph Smith in Rushville, and they were there to arrest 10 or 12 Missourians to arrest. They were there to arrest Joseph Smith and take him into Missouri, which Joseph Smith believed meant certain death. So while Joseph Smith was basically under arrest, sitting in Nauvoo, waiting upon the messages from his attorney, Cyrus Walker, who was trying to convince the Governor Ford to reverse the extradition orders to take Joseph Smith into Missouri, Joseph Smith decides to have a revelation on polygamy. Now, in this original revelation you can find in the Joseph Smith Papers website, Joseph Smith makes some interesting statements. Number one, he clarifies the only prophet elected by God can authorize polygamy, and only through the authorized prophet can this revelation of polygamy come. Okay, what's interesting is this is hint, hint, or maybe a code, because Joseph Smith resigns within 4 days of this revelation. Joseph Smith resigns as the one and true prophet, transfers the office of prophet to his brother Hiram, who then reverses this polygamy revelation. Hiram Smith consistently thereafter denies and denounces polygamy. He verifies that Joseph Smith had a revelation on sealing celestial families, but that this revelation, whatever it was, did not authorize having more than one wife on the earth that was living at a time. The other interesting, I believe, secret message that Joseph Smith is trying to give the Nauvoo residents is that polygamy was not authorized by God through Abraham, but it was authorized through Hagar, Ishmael, the progenitors of the Muslim faith. That Abraham, through the seed of Isaac, did not authorize polygamy. And I will show you in Galatians where Paul specifically states that Hagar represents the Muslim faith, the Mount of Zion, and the Old Testament, while Sarah and Abraham represent the Christian faith. Therefore, this is, for any biblical scholars, a secret message saying that polygamy is only and condemned by Christians because it is part of the Ishmaeli or the Islamic faith and not part of the Christian faith.
For it is written that Abraham had 2 sons, the one by a bondmaid, the other by a free woman. But he who was of the bondwoman was born after the flesh, but he of the free woman was by promise. Which things are an allegory? For these are the 2 covenants, the one from the Mount Sinai, which gendereth to bondage, which is Hagar. For this Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia, and answereth to Jerusalem, which now is and is in bondage with her children. But Jerusalem, which is above, is free, which is the mother of us all. Now we, brethren, as Isaac was, are the children of promise. But as then he that was born after the flesh persecuted him that was born after the Spirit, even so it is now. Nevertheless, what saith the Scripture? Cast out the bondwoman and her son, for the son of the bondwoman shall not be heir with the son of the free woman. So then, brethren, we are not children of the bondwoman, but of the free.
It is my belief that this Hagar reference, Joseph Smith does not mention Sarah, but mentions Hagar and Ishmael, which St. Paul in Galatians state that this means the Old Testament that Christ has come to fulfill, that the Old Testament prophecies were no longer in force under Christian faith through Abraham and Sarah. So that's another, I believe, coded message by Joseph Smith that if in fact he did sign off on this revelation, it was done under coercion and done under the threat of death. So despite all the craziness in the political situation in Nauvoo, under which Joseph Smith was under extreme political pressure and under the threat of being extradited and possibly murdered in Missouri, under this crazy and chaotic circumstance, Joseph Smith suddenly has the quote-unquote, the revelation on polygamy. And number 2, another coded message, he says in this revelation, that my house is a house of order and not of confusion. Well, what could be more confusing than Joseph Smith's actions and conduct during this period of time where he was under arrest and being threatened to be taken into Missouri and killed? Well, let's see how crazy Joseph Smith can get in the aftermath of having this purported crazy revelation. Well, on the very same day of July 12, 1843, when the revelation was received by Joseph Smith, Hiram, it's written after 6 blank lines, which usually means they are waiting to insert some additional information there. Anyway, it says, Hiram took the revelation and read it to Emma. Now, we know in the revelation that Joseph Smith states that unless Emma accepts it, she shall be destroyed. Well, supposedly, according to myth, Emma Smith burns the revelation immediately on obtaining it. But not only that, crazier still, Emma's not going to be destroyed. No, Joseph Smith does the exact opposite. Joseph Smith, and I quote, I directed Clayton to make out deeds of certain lots of land to Emma and the children. Okay, so on the very same day, he claims that he is going to destroy Emma for not accepting the revelation, and supposedly she burns it. Joseph Smith directs Clayton to make out certain deeds of land to Emma and transfer his property to Emma and the children. Later on, I'll show you this included 60 lots and his entire ownership in the Maid of Iowa, the steamboat that was worth a lot at the time. Okay, and that they used up and down the Mississippi River around Nauvoo. They would take pleasure cruises on this particular steamboat, the Maid of Iowa, and it allowed the emissaries to go back and forth up the river to carry information, and it also carried the rescuers of Joseph Smith up the Mississippi. So this steamboat was very important. After the revelation, Joseph Smith directs all of his property to be transferred to Emma and the children, and I believe this is evidence that Joseph Smith was planning on leaving Nauvoo, or escaping, if in fact they could not obtain the reversal of Governor Ford, the reversal of the extradition. Joseph Smith was planning on escaping. The one thing that the Utah Church fails to recognize is how close Joseph Smith and Emma Smith were, and that Joseph Smith depended on Emma as not only being an emissary in many cases, but also in being his close advisor. So the very next day after the purported polygamy revelation, Joseph Smith writes, I was in conversation with Emma most of the day. Secondly, he approved the revised laws of the Legion. That meant they were getting ready probably for some kind of insurrection or violence that may occur if, in fact, the extradition order was not reversed by Governor Ford. But let's go down to July 16, 1843, 4 days after the revelation of polygamy. Okay, here Joseph Smith preaches all day, all morning and evening at the grove near the west of the temple. And what does he state? He says that there are foes that are living among the saints in Nauvoo, that the spirit that's crucified Jesus is in the breasts of some of those who profess to be saints in Nauvoo. Who could he be referring to? Well, you've got it. John C. Bennett and Sidney Rigdon are now in Springville trying to convince Governor Ford to extradite Joseph Smith. And according to John C. Bennett, they did not leave the side of Governor Ford during this period of time. But number 3, the 12 are now waiting I believe in Cincinnati, on word of whether, 1, Joseph Smith signed the revelation on polygamy, which they were already practicing polygamy in secret, but number 2, whether or not Joseph Smith was going to agree to resign as prophet. And this is in fact what happened. So on July 16th, Sunday, 4 days after the revelation, Joseph Smith mentions that there are enemies among the saints in Nauvoo, and number 2, he is resigning the office of prophet to his brother Hiram Smith. Now remember, according to the Revelation on polygamy, there's only one prophet at a time on the earth, and now Joseph Smith resigns this office, gives it to Hiram, who now becomes the only one true prophet of the Mormon Church on earth. He says right here, after he claims there are secret enemies in Nauvoo, he says, I would not prophesy anymore and propose that Hiram Smith to hold the office of prophet to the church, and it was his birthright. I am going to have a reformation. That's a familiar term, a reformation, and the saints must regard Hiram, for he has the authority that I might be a priest of the Most High God. And then he slightly touched upon the subject of the everlasting covenant. Okay? I believe that is a secret code to the 12 safety in Cincinnati saying, yes, I signed under coercion your revelation you gave to me on polygamy. So he just touches upon the everlasting covenant. But he does not announce that polygamy is an authorized policy, nor does he mention he had the revelation, which he should have mentioned if in fact he agreed with the revelation, which, as we know, until his death, he denied that he ever had a revelation authorizing having more than one wife living at a time on earth. But he did authorize an everlasting covenant of having families sealed together in heaven. So he continues, the everlasting covenant, showing that a man and a wife may enter into a covenant in this world, for he has no claim on her in the next world, but on account of the unbelief of the people, I cannot reveal the fullness of these things at the present. Whether or not Joseph Smith actually said that, we don't know, but let's assume, for argument's sake, we're taking these statements as factual and accurate. This is a secret code, I believe, to the 12 that he signed off on the Revelation 132 under extreme coercion and under the threat of death, and then he resigned so that the 12 can take over eventually the church, as they want to do later on after the death of both Hiram and Joseph. That is why Hiram also had to be murdered. So resigning the office of prophet gave Joseph Smith two options. It freed him up from having to be engaged in all this political chicanery dealing with not only polygamy but at the anti-slavery movement. Number two, it allowed him to be free to escape if he needed, if the extradition did go through and he was required to go into Missouri and be assassinated or executed. So it freed him up. Number three, it signed all his property over to Emma in preparation of escaping, and he was leaving the church in good hands with Hiram. So here is another interesting entry of another person, and I don't know exactly who it is, who is mentioning they also heard the speech of Joseph Smith on the 16th when he abdicated the office of prophet to Hiram. It's writing, it looks like, to the 12 in Cincinnati. It says Sunday the 16th. Joseph Smith preached all day, and he preached about Matthew chapter 27. But the writer of this entry says, I did not hear him. But he talks about a man's foes residing in his own house. The spirit of crucifixion of Christ, that same spirit in Nauvoo. He referred to who he referred to in particular, it is unknown. I won't say who, this writer says. Was it the brother William Marks? He did not say. Was it Brother Cole? I did not hear the sermon. Why ask me? Nothing new, same as when you left. The spirit was against Christ because of his innocence. So in the present case, said he would not prophesy anymore, and that Hiram Smith should be the prophet. Did not tell them that he was going to be a priest, Now Nora King, by and by, told the elders not to prophesy when they went out preaching. So Joseph Smith is now retrenching even more. He's claiming that only Hyrum Smith can now prophesy, and that none of the elders, when they go out and do their missionary work, can engage in any prophecy. But it's interesting that whoever is writing this entry is trying to guess who, in fact, the people that Joseph Smith was referring to as being traitors. We find out later on, according to a young lad called Eaton, that it was the Fosters, the Higsbys, and etc., many other people, including Laws, the Wilson and William Law, including, everybody in Nauvoo that was. So on July 19th, and this is going to be 7 days after Joseph Smith has the revelation on polygamy, 3 days after he resigns as prophet, that Willard Richards sends a coded message to the 12 who are waiting in Cincinnati to hear whether or not, one, Joseph Smith had signed off on the revelation, and then number 2, did Joseph Smith resign? So here Willard Richards sends, wink, wink, nod, nod, a message to the 12. On the 19th, he says, Willard Richards, I send by this mail 6 papers to Brothers Woodruff, same direction. Just met Hyrum in the street. Said to him, I am writing to the brethren. Has our new prophet anything to say to them? Then Hyrum, wink, wink, nod, nod, give them my respects to them. The elders Taylor and Orson Hyde, my best compliments, with success. And then Willard Richards says, great love to you all, mine in particular to all your brethren forever, Willard. So I believe this is the message where Willard Richards tells the brethren, the elders in Cincinnati, that yes, their bargain with Joseph Smith has been effectuated. Number 2, sign off on the revelation. Number 2, resign. And number 3, throw the political support of Nauvoo in favor of the Democratic pro-slavery candidate, Mr. Hogue, away from Joseph Smith's personal friend and attorney, Cyrus Walker, who is a Whig and anti-slavery. And that was the third prong that Joseph Smith was promising the quorum who are waiting in Cincinnati for this message. Now you have the quorum of the 12 waiting for Joseph Smith to resign, but you have Sidney Rigdon and John C. Bennett in Springville during this period of time trying to pressure Governor Ford into extraditing Joseph Smith. Yes, Sidney Rigdon and John C. Bennett were co-conspirators, as Joseph Smith believed. Since May of 1842, Joseph Smith suspected Sidney Rigdon of being his enemy and co-conspirator with John C. Bennett, which he turns out to be. We know that after Joseph Smith's assassination, who does Sidney Rigdon show up in Nauvoo with, claiming to be the authorized leader of the Mormon Church? Well, it's Sidney Rigdon and his friend John C. Bennett. Okay, so also, how do we know the quorum of the 12 who are waiting in Cincinnati and John C. Bennett and Sidney Rigdon are conspiring on hopefully getting rid of Joseph Smith? Well, it's because later on in this document, Willard Richards mentions, oh, dear brethren in Cincinnati, I forgot to send you a letter of introduction to General Bennett. So I'm sending it with this post, your letter of introduction, so you can go talk to John C. Bennett, who's in Springville right now, trying to convince the governor to extradite Joseph Smith. Well, it's my belief that this letter of introduction also carried with it the quorum of the 12 telling John C. Bennett that they were now in charge, that they had gotten Joseph Smith to resign, and that they were taking over the business of the church. That's my belief. But you can differ with me, but I'm just saying all these circumstances are very suspicious and shows, I believe, very strongly that the polygamy revelation was done under extreme coercion and even the threat of death. And Joseph Smith was scrambling to, number one, pass all his property over to Emma, 2, resign the office of prophet, and 3, get the heck out of Dodge just in case the extradition was not reversed by Governor Ford, which we do know eventually it was, but still Joseph Smith was kept in fear for at least 30 to 45 days while he had to do all this political maneuvering. Number 3, particularly for Governor Ford, he had to make sure that Nauvoo voted Democratic and not Whig. And that is exactly what happened. When Joseph Smith voted, he said personally, for his friend and attorney, Cyrus Walker, a Whig, he deferred to Hiram Smith, who then Hiram Smith said that the Democratic Party should be voted on, that they were the ones that favored the Mormons, and that so the Mormons did vote in the Democratic Party, which was the pro-slavery, and they did this under threat. It is talked about in this document that unless Nauvoo went Democratic, that Joseph Smith would be extradited. So Joseph Smith had to make sure that Nauvoo voted Democratic, and he did this to save his own life. So I will try and show you that before I end this video. So here is the entry on July 18th, written by Elder Willard Richards, the following to President Brigham Young, as president of the quorum. By this time, I suppose you would like to hear a word from the city of the prophets. I forgot to hand you your introduction to General Bennett. Therefore, I enclose it in this. Don't forget to remember me to the general and his delightful family. My most warm regards, together with Mrs. Richards. Sealed and delivered. And then here's a message. He says, if it suits you, as you pass by our office on the 7th, I discharge my last charge of powder and ball over your heads. I have no occasion to reload since. All is peace. In other words, Willard Richards is sending the 12. Everything has been accomplished. So give my warm regards to General Bennett when you meet him. And the 12 can only meet General Bennett if they go to Springfield, which is where General Bennett and Sidney Rigdon are, hoping to convince Governor Ford not to revoke his authorization to extradite Joseph Smith. So what Willard Richards is saying, all is peace here. Everything has been accomplished. Joseph Smith has resigned. Joseph Smith has resigned as prophet, and all has been accomplished. The polygamy revelation has been signed. Joseph Smith has resigned as prophet. And number 3, everyone's going to be voting Democratic and not Whig, per Joseph Smith, throwing the political support over to Hiram, who is now engaging everybody to vote Democratic, which of course Joseph Smith would have never done during this period of time. But Joseph Smith is planning on leaving, and all has been accomplished with this secret coded message by Willard Richards to President Brigham Young, who's sitting in Cincinnati, saying, here you go, President Brigham Young. Here is your letter of introduction to our most famous friend and colleague, General Bennett. We know General Bennett was the arch enemy of Joseph Smith. And what is the terminology? The friend of my enemy is my enemy, something like that. Well, any friend of General Bennett, which is the 12 apostles, and Willard Richards, is also an enemy of Joseph Smith. Here it is, their absolute message to General Bennett, who is responsible for trying to get Joseph Smith assassinated and extradited into Missouri. Was Doctrine and Covenants, Section 132, Revelation on polygamy, done by Joseph Smith while he was under the threat of death? Was this revelation, if Joseph Smith authored it, was it done while Joseph Smith was under the threat of extradition into Missouri and certain death? And was it done as a bargaining chip to the 12 who were sitting in Cincinnati waiting to see if Joseph Smith would, number one, sign a revelation on polygamy, which they were already practicing, and number two, immediately resign as prophet of the church, with Joseph Smith within 4 days of authoring this purported revelation, resigned as a prophet of the Mormon church and transferred all powers of the prophet to Hyrum Smith. This was done while Joseph Smith was under the threat of being extradited into Missouri and what Joseph Smith believed to be certain death. So again, my question is, was this 132 revelation, if signed by Joseph Smith, done under extreme coercion and threat of death, and done as a bargaining chip for his life, for him to resign as prophet of the church and then get the heck out of Dodge to save his own life? I think these are questions that need to be asked, because this revelation was not done in a vacuum. It was done under extreme political upheaval in Nauvoo, and under the time that there was an insurrection being planned in which the entire Nauvoo charter was under threat of being revoked and under a threat of extreme violence from outside forces, part of which was done under threat of Sidney Rigdon and John C. Bennett, who were in Springfield pressuring Governor Ford to extradite Joseph Smith into Missouri and his execution. Or number two, the 12 who are sitting in Cincinnati waiting to see if they're going to take over Nauvoo after Joseph Smith resigns, but only after Joseph Smith signs a revelation on polygamy. Polygamy which the 12 were already practicing in secret, and with Joseph Smith had already excommunicated many of these secret practitioners, including John C. Bennett. So this is the extreme threat of violence that was going on